Joseph was not hated because he did something evil. He was hated because everyone in the house could already feel the imbalance, and once people start comparing love inside a family, the damage usually begins long before anyone notices it. Jacob had many sons, but Joseph was different. Not officially, not verbally, just obviously. Different attention, different affection, different patience, and eventually, different gifts, which is how emotional problems usually become visible. Then the tunic arrived. Expensive, colorful, impossible to miss. The kind of gift that says, "Dad absolutely had a favorite and stop trying to hide it." The brothers saw it immediately. Of course they did. Nobody misses favoritism when they're standing outside of it. It's like parents saying, "I love all my children equally," while one child somehow keeps receiving bonus rewards from a competition nobody else knew existed. Everybody notices. Nobody enjoys it. And Joseph kept wearing the tunic everywhere, which, socially speaking, was not a strong strategic decision. At first, the resentment stayed quiet. The brothers still worked together, ate together, pretended everything was normal, but emotionally, the house was already splitting underneath the surface. Because the tunic was never the real problem, it was proof that something had already been happening for years. Jacob trusted Joseph differently, protected him differently, listened to him differently. And every time that happened, the resentment grew a little stronger. That's the dangerous thing about comparison. It rarely explodes immediately. First, it accumulates, quietly, slowly, like pressure building inside walls nobody checks anymore. Joseph, meanwhile, seemed completely unaware of how bad things were becoming, or maybe he noticed and simply underestimated it, which is usually how family disasters begin. The brothers stopped seeing him as just another sibling. Now he was becoming something else, a reminder, a symbol, a walking example of unequal love. And once resentment attaches itself to a person, almost everything they do becomes irritating automatically. The way they talk, the way they walk, the way they breathe. Joseph had entered that stage. Meanwhile, Jacob probably believed he was simply showing extra affection to the son he loved most. Which sounds harmless right up until your family starts emotionally collapsing in slow motion. Because this is where love turns into fuel for resentment. And resentment inside families becomes dangerous very quickly, especially when nobody talks about it directly. The brothers did not explode immediately. That's what makes the situation worse. Silence was organizing itself. Every look lasted slightly longer. Every conversation became slightly colder. Every interaction carried weight nobody admitted out loud. And Joseph kept walking into the middle of it wearing the tunic, confidently, like someone completely unaware he was slowly becoming the center of a future disaster. Then something even more dangerous arrived. Not another gift, not another robe, a dream. And unlike the tunic, this one was impossible to wear quietly. The situation inside the house was already unstable. Then Joseph started describing dreams where everyone bowed to him, which somehow made the atmosphere worse, impressively worse, because there are many ways to share a dream. Joseph accidentally chose the worst possible version. He told his brothers about bundles of grain bowing down to his bundle. Then later, the sun, moon, and stars bowing down too, which translated into normal human language sounded a lot like, "One day, all of you will stand beneath me." And the timing could not have been worse. The resentment was already there. The favoritism was already visible. The tension was already growing. Now Joseph was adding destiny on top of it. This is the part where emotional intelligence quietly leaves the building, because some truths arrive too early to be accepted, especially by people who already feel overlooked. It's like announcing a future promotion to co-workers who already resent you. Technically, maybe you're just sharing exciting news. Emotionally, you've just declared war in the break room. Joseph did not seem arrogant in the traditional sense. That's what makes the story more complicated. He sounded convinced, certain, almost naive, like someone describing the future without realizing how threatening it sounded to everybody else. And honestly, the dreams themselves were not even the entire problem. The delivery was. There are things people can eventually accept, but not when humiliation arrives attached to them. The brothers listened, silently, which in family situations is rarely a good sign. Nobody celebrated the dreams. Nobody said, "Wow, Joseph, incredible vision. Thank you for sharing." The room simply became heavier. Jacob himself reacted carefully, not because the dreams sounded impossible, but because even he could feel the damage spreading through the family. And Joseph kept talking, which again was not helping strategically at all. The brothers were no longer just annoyed by the favoritism. Now they felt replaced by the future itself. That changes everything, because resentment becomes much more dangerous once people believe they are losing importance permanently. At first, they envied the attention Joseph received. Now they hated what Joseph represented, and representation is powerful. Joseph was becoming the visible reminder of everything they feared, being less valued, less trusted, less important, less chosen. That kind of resentment rarely disappears naturally. Usually it waits, quietly, patiently, like a storm deciding when to arrive. Joseph, meanwhile, kept describing the dreams with complete confidence, which felt less like inspiration and more like emotional gasoline. The brothers stopped hearing dreams. Now they heard hierarchy, status, power, the future, and worst of all, Joseph sounded completely certain about it. That certainty made the dreams feel personal, because confidence can sound inspiring to supporters. But to resentful people, confidence often sounds like provocation. And now the brothers finally had something dangerous, a target. Not vague frustration, not silent comparison, not emotional suspicion, a person. Someone they could point to, someone they could blame, someone they were beginning to imagine removing. Because now they knew exactly who they wanted to bring down. By this point, the family was no longer functioning normally. Technically, everyone was still living together. Emotionally, the collapse had already started. The brothers no longer saw Joseph as simply annoying. Now he felt dangerous. The favoritism had created resentment. The dreams had given that resentment direction. And once anger finds a target, things escalate very quickly. At first, the hostility stayed subtle, shorter answers, longer silences, conversations stopping when Joseph walked nearby. The kind of atmosphere where nobody says anything directly, but everybody can feel something turning hostile underneath the surface. Joseph either failed to notice this completely or kept underestimating how serious it had become. Neither option was ideal. Meanwhile, the brothers were spending more time together without him, which sounds harmless, until you remember resentment becomes stronger when groups start validating each other emotionally. At first, people complain. Then they repeat the complaints. Then eventually the complaints start sounding reasonable. That's the dangerous stage. The brothers had stopped asking, "Why does Father favor him?" Now they were asking, "What do we do about him?" And those are very different conversations. It's the moment a frustrated group quietly transforms into an organized one, like co-workers no longer venting about management and beginning to discuss who should get fired first. The hostility was becoming structured, organized, patient. Joseph, meanwhile, believed he was visiting family. The brothers were already discussing whether he should disappear permanently, which is a terrible level of miscommunication inside one household. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on the others while they were working far from home, which, considering the emotional situation, was almost unbelievably optimistic parenting. Joseph went looking for them, confidently, still wearing the symbols of favoritism, still carrying the confidence of the dreams, still unaware he was walking directly toward people who had been emotionally collapsing around him for years. Then the brothers saw him approaching in the distance, and immediately the atmosphere changed. Not panic, not surprise, decision. That's the chilling part of the story. The hatred did not explode suddenly. It had been building quietly for a long time, slowly organizing itself in silence. Every moment of comparison, every visible difference, every dream, every reminder. The resentment had been stacking layer after layer until eventually Joseph stopped feeling like a brother altogether. Now he felt like the problem itself. And once someone becomes the problem inside a resentful group, empathy disappears frighteningly fast. The brothers started talking openly, not emotionally, practically, coldly, like people discussing logistics instead of family. That's when the story crosses into dangerous territory. Because the pit did not create the hatred, it only revealed how deep it already was, and Joseph still kept walking toward them, completely unaware that the conversation waiting ahead was no longer about resentment. Now it was about removal. Because silence inside families can become dangerous when it finally starts organizing itself, and the favoritism was finally about to collect its price. The brothers did not hesitate for very long, which says a lot about how long the resentment had already been growing. The moment Joseph arrived, the conversation stopped pretending to be normal. Now the hostility was visible, direct, unhidden. Joseph approached expecting family. The brothers looked at him and saw years of accumulated frustration walking toward them in expensive fabric. Then everything happened quickly. They grabbed him, dragged him down, ripped the tunic away. The famous symbol of favoritism finally disappeared in the dirt, which was probably emotionally satisfying for about 3 seconds before the situation became deeply horrifying. Joseph was thrown into a pit, empty, dry, no way out. And this is usually the moment people imagine as the lowest point of the story. But strangely, the pit itself was not the worst part. The worst part was hearing his own brothers calmly discussing what to do with him next. That changes the entire scene. Because falling hurts, but realizing nobody intends to pull you back out hurts differently. Joseph listened from the bottom while the brothers argued above him, not emotionally, practically, coldly, like people discussing inventory instead of a human being. One brother wanted to kill him, another argued against it, others calculated alternatives. Meanwhile, Joseph was still down inside the pit, hearing his future being negotiated in real time, which is an unbelievably traumatic family meeting. And then somehow the story becomes even colder. The brothers sat down to eat, while Joseph remained trapped below them. That detail alone tells you everything about how normalized the resentment had become. Because hatred becomes extremely dangerous once people stop seeing suffering as important. At that point, empathy had almost completely disappeared. Then, traders appeared nearby. And suddenly, the brothers found a solution that felt profitable. Joseph would not be rescued. He would be sold, which is a brutal sentence to say out loud about your own sibling. The favored son became a transaction, a product, a moving piece of emotional revenge. The irony is almost unbearable. The child most protected by love was now completely unprotected by it. And Joseph could do absolutely nothing about it. That's what makes the scene psychologically terrifying. The pit confirmed something worse than betrayal. Joseph was completely alone now, not misunderstood, not disliked. Alone, because the real pain was never just the fall itself. It was discovering the people surrounding him had already emotionally left long before he touched the bottom. The brothers pulled him out of the pit, not to save him, to transfer ownership, which somehow feels even darker. Then Joseph disappeared into the caravan heading toward Egypt, while the brothers prepared the story they would tell their father. And the terrifying part? The family had not collapsed in one violent moment. It collapsed slowly, through comparison, favoritism, silence, resentment, layer after layer, until eventually selling a brother started sounding reasonable. And even though Joseph was finally out of the pit, the real fall was only beginning. Joseph's story is usually remembered as a story about dreams, or destiny, or survival. But long before Egypt, prison, power, or reconciliation, the real damage started inside the house. That's the uncomfortable part. Because the family did not collapse from one sudden act of evil. It collapsed slowly, quietly, through comparison repeated too many times. Jacob loved Joseph deeply. That part was real. But once love becomes visibly unequal inside a family, it stops feeling safe to everyone else involved. And eventually somebody pays for it emotionally. In this case, everybody did. Joseph paid for it first. The brothers carried resentment for years before they finally acted on it. And Jacob eventually experienced the consequences of the very imbalance he helped create, which turns the entire story into something much more human than people expect. Because favoritism rarely creates peace. Usually, It creates competition disguised as family. At first, the signs looked small: extra attention, different treatment, one son standing slightly above the others emotionally. Then, the tunic appeared and made the imbalance visible. Then the dreams arrived and made the future feel unequal too. And suddenly the brothers were no longer just dealing with jealousy. Now they felt replaceable. That changes people. Because once human beings believe they are being emotionally downgraded, resentment grows incredibly fast, especially inside families where comparison already lives permanently under the surface. That's why the story feels strangely modern. The setting is ancient. The emotional dynamics are not. Families still compare siblings. People still compete for validation. Parents still create emotional hierarchies without realizing how destructive they can become. And resentment still grows best in silence. That's the terrifying part. Nobody sat down and officially announced, "This family is collapsing." It happened gradually, one interaction at a time, one comparison at a time, one quiet resentment at a time. Until eventually, throwing Joseph into a pit started sounding reasonable. Then selling him sounded practical. That progression is what makes the story disturbing. Because the brothers did not become monsters instantly, they became emotionally consumed slowly. And Joseph himself was not completely innocent socially either. The dreams mattered, not because they were false, but because confidence without awareness can accidentally provoke wounded people. Joseph kept speaking like someone protected by love, without realizing love itself had already isolated him from everyone around him. That's the irony holding the entire story together. The thing meant to protect him became the thing separating him. The love that elevated him also exposed him. And by the time Joseph finally left in chains toward Egypt, the emotional collapse had already happened long before the caravan moved. Because Joseph fell into the pit because of his brothers, but the hole itself had started forming years earlier inside the family.